Alright guys, this is part 2. This is just simple tutorials. This is just kind of covering the basics. I'm going to pick up right where I left off. So we just went over the post-processing. Next tab we're going to look at here is the Dupes tab. Now dupes, I don't use this much because there is a better version and we'll get into that here soon. But it's pretty simple when, okay, say, let's just spawn a couple items. Say we got a couple of barrels here or whatever, and you have your duplicator tool. Oh, actually, let's go ahead and constrain these together, which again, we'll talk about this kind of stuff later. But say you want to save this cool contraption or whatever. You right click it, which copies, and then you can paste it like that. Or you can go to your dupes tab, click save dupe. And what that'll do is it'll save it. See that? So now all you have to do is hit deploy, it'll pull up. Here's another one I did just a couple minutes ago. Bam! Oh, look at that! So that saved contraption I did with all my lovely, lovely barrels. Anyway, so that's the dupes tab. You can find things based on your subscriptions to the community pages and stuff, or like the popular dupes and whatnot, which, I don't really ever use because I just make my own stuff. And a lot of these are honestly pretty stupid. And yeah, that's the dupes page, or tab. Saves, I've never really had a purpose for because I don't really do anything as far as this stuff goes. But if you're going to do anything like comic strips or posing and things like that, where it really kind of depends on the whole map being saved instead of just a regular dupe, kind of like this, saves are useful for that. So if you want to save the whole map and everything in it, click the save game, and that'll save your current game. Now, if you load a game, it's going to quit out. So it'll act like you hit escape and then exit out of the game, and, well, not exit out of the game, but exit out of the current session and start a new one. So keep that in mind. So don't load a save unless you are ready to quit out. And alright, so that's all the top tabs here. And we'll just go ahead and head over onto the other side. So you've been kind of looking at this box here this whole time. Well, what's this box over here? Well, this is another section generally meant for your tools. So I'm just going to go over here, just make that look nice. The first thing I kind of want to show you is neither of these. It's that very basic Garry's Mod tool. Now this is called the physics gun. Yours may be a different color, and you can change the color. I'll teach you that probably in a little bit. But for the most part, it looks like this. Just what it does, let's just spawn in something. When you have a prop or anything and you want to move it, you can run into it and try to push it around that way or whatnot. But the easiest way to do it is use this, because once you grab it, it moves. See that? I can click and drag and it moves it around. Now, the easiest way to think of how this works is imagine you're just extending your arm really, really far. And where you click is how you're picking up, and your arm is just still extended. So if you keep moving around, it's just going to move around relative to that arm extension. You can't bring it closer to you unless you scroll with your mouse wheel. If you scroll it, it comes closer. Mine's set kind of fast, so it comes really fast. Now, if you do that, you can obviously move it around. But if you notice, this is staying flat. How do I get this to set up straight? Well, you'll see a lot of players do this. And yeah, that worked. But the problem is it can be a little, I don't know, not very good. It's not very reliable, I should say. Anyway, so the way you really should do it is you hold E on your button, on your keyboard, that button there. And what it'll do is, when you move your mouse, it'll rotate. And it's kind of wonky when you first learn how to, or start doing it. We won't really understand how it all works, but the more you mess with it, the more you'll start to understand how it moves relative to your world in 3D space. And that right there is the second most useful thing about this tool, the physics gun. See that? It's just staying there in midair versus dropping like that. What you do is if you hold down the main mouse button, your left mouse button, and then right click, see what it did there? It froze. So I right clicked and then let off both buttons and it freezes it in place, which is really useful. So say you want to build something pretty unique or whatever, but you need it to be in the air or whatever, you can save it like that. And also, one last good tip for this is if you're rotating an object and say you want it to be perfectly flat again, but you don't obviously have the like a floor to place it on or something, if it's like that. Well, what you can do is if you get it fairly close to flat or any of the nearest 45-degree angles relative to that, if you hold shift while you're holding E, it will snap to the nearest 45-degree angle. So that's perfectly flat. Now, if I was to do it, say I want to kind of get it really straight up and down, well, that's just not very straight. If I hold shift and E, it snaps. Now that's a very, very useful for when you're building something complex tool, or, well, tool tip, I guess. Anyway, so that's the physics gun. The physics gun's probably the most important tool in the game. One of the most, at least. Alright, so let's get into the actual tools. So, when someone says you need to get the weld tool, or the rope tool, or the thruster tool, they're talking about these here. So when you go to tools, you'll have a big, long list. And if you've just downloaded Garry's mod, you probably won't have half of these, because a lot of these are add-ons. I would recommend you try to get, look into what's good and what's not. I would suggest what you see here is probably some of the better ones. A lot of people have more, a lot of people have less. This is just what I have. But we'll go over some of the basics real quick, and then maybe when I make more tutorials on how to specifically build certain things, I can go more in detail of each individual one. But for now, we'll just do the very basics. So we're going to grab a couple of barrels here, and we're going to weld them together. So right now, they're just two separate barrels. They move away from each other. They don't do anything. Well, what we're going to do is going to weld them together so they can't do that. So they'll be stuck together. A lot of people think of it as gluing. A lot of people think of it as, well, it's technically called a constraint. It's called a parent constraint, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. Anyway, so you find your weld tool. It's located here under constraints. And leave this normal for right now. Don't do anything right here. And you'll click one prop and click the other. If you notice up in the top left-hand side, it says what the tool will do. So, the first line, select an object to begin a weld constraint. Though that will generally tell you how to use a lot of these, but some of them can get a lot more complicated than that. Anyway, so I click the two props, and that will create a weld between the two. So what happens if I move one, the other will move. If I rotate it, the other one rotates with it. So it becomes kind of like a one prop. They are similar to to the same position. One thing to keep in mind about this, it's not perfect. You have to remember that Garry's mod is an old game, and the physics engine on it can't handle a lot of different things, and specifically it can't handle something like this. I'm going to take and rotate this down into the ground, and yeah, you see what's happening there? It's no longer doing it correctly. So when you get more advanced stuff, when you're building really complex vehicles or just complex things in general, you'll learn ways to fix that. But for now, just remember that that's always an issue, and that kind of thing right there can happen. It'll freak out, and when things freak out like that, it's really quite hard on your game or server that you're on. So it's generally recommended not to do that kind of stuff. And yeah, that's pretty much just weld. You just click two props and it'll weld it together. But there's also the weld tool, or excuse me, the options, the settings for it. And each tool has its own setting, so all these all change. For the weld tool, it's pretty simple. There's really only one thing. You can read this, and basically what it means is the force limit is how strong that weld is going to be. Now, a lot of people they'll go in here and they'll weld it, and then they'll weld it again, and weld it again, and weld it again. That doesn't actually do anything. With the game, the way it's set up, once you weld it once, you can't weld it again. It's still only going to do it once. So if you're doing something and you need it to be really strong so that weld will never break and the props will always be together, make sure that your force limit is set to 0, complete 0. If it's anything other than 0, it will break. It says right here. If it's not set to 0, it will break. So if we give get rid of that weld. If we set that to something not... Actually, let's make sure that weld... Yeah, the weld did go away. Something that's not 0, so 70.75. And weld. Okay, it welded. But you'll see that as I try to... Yeah, it broke. The weld broke immediately. Because that's such a weak weld that just the slightest little nudge can break it. And even that broke it. Just that barrel rolling broke that weld. So you have to take these kinds of things into consideration when you're building things. It gets pretty complicated, especially when you start doing things with multiple tools doing multiple things. So that's a weld. And, well, you know what? I'm kind of running out on time here. So I'm going to go ahead and end it here. And if you want to watch more, if you're liking it, let's go into video 3. See ya.